Okay, great. Again, my name is Selby Abraham. Thank you, Maria. I'm a staff attorney with SOAR Immigration Legal Services. It's a program of the Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. Our office is located in Northeast Portland. I'm also an attorney with the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the Oregon chapter of immigration attorneys here in the state of Oregon. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I know we scheduled this for last month, but snow fell down on us and we had to reschedule, so thank you for the invitation once again to come back this month. I'm really excited to speak with you guys about the current state of DACA. Before I continue, a few things. I'm getting over a cold, so if I have a coughing fit in the middle of this, please have patience with me. I just need to get a cough drop, some water. Another thing is I'm here in my capacity as an attorney, but I'm not here to dole out legal advice. I'm doing a general presentation about DACA, and I'm happy to answer questions. However, if it's a question that's really specific, that it's like, oh, I know this person who has this, what should they do? I might say, unfortunately, I'm not able to answer that specific question. I can answer questions generally about DACA, about application process, about legislation, but that doesn't mean you should refrain from asking questions. I'm happy to answer questions throughout. Better to just ask the questions and just be open that I might not be able to answer it if it is specific legal advice. So again, this is general advice. Not general advice, general presentation, not legal advice, but just a little bit information about the DACA program. At the end, if time allows, I do have information about Know Your Rights as well. It goes off in a whole different discussion about someone's rights here in the country. I'm happy to go that route. I wanted to first focus on DACA because it seems like it's more imminent in terms of current events. And so I wanted to make sure I gave that opportunity to speak more generally about DACA. If time permits, I'm happy to go down the route to speak about Know Your Rights. At the end of the presentation, I do have a packet of information about Know Your Rights that I'm happy to pass to all of you. If we covered it or not, at the very least, you'll be able to walk away with this information. This includes information about my organization as well as other legal nonprofit organizations that provide immigration legal services, with information about if you do know someone or you yourself are interested in having a consultation with an immigration attorney, there's information for how to do so there, okay? So by the end of this, I hope you guys will walk away with some new knowledge, some information, so that if you don't retain it all today, at least you'll walk away with some more information as well. Okay? All right. So let's get started. Just to begin with, who's heard of DACA? Can you raise your hand? Okay. All right. So we've heard of it. Now the question is, what is it and what's happening to it? Okay? DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Okay? It's a program that started in 2012 under the Obama administration. It's an executive order. It is not a law. It's an executive order. It is not a law. Okay? An executive order, if you guys can remember back to social studies in high school, we have our different branches of government. We have our executive branch, the legislative branch, and judicial branch. The executive branch, of course, is the U.S. president. And so an order from the U.S. president is specific into that part of the government, but a president, of course, cannot create laws. But what President Obama did was he created deferred action. What is deferred action? It just means that someone who has this benefit will not be a priority for deportation by immigration, okay? So it doesn't mean that it's amnesty. It doesn't mean that it's legal status. It doesn't mean right now that there is a pathway to a green card or citizenship. It's just deferred action. It's a program that was started by President Obama in 2012. Here are some of the requirements for someone who is eligible for DACA. The person arrived in the U.S. before age 16. They had no lawful status of any kind by June 15, 2012. They were enrolled in some kind of school, graduated from high school, or obtained a GED. They were present in the United States since June 15, 2007, and they were present in the United States as of June 15, 2012, has not left the country since then. A person who fits these requirements could apply before U.S. immigration to ask for a 2-year deferred action status, DACA beneficiary. What does that status present? It gives an opportunity to have 2-year permission of work, the opportunity for a social security card, and the chance to get a driver's license here in the state, okay? And then that beneficiary had the opportunity to renew generally every 2 years, okay? So that started in 2012. Again, deferred action is not legal status. It's basically a deferral, a delay of action against the immigrant. So with DACA status, that person is not a priority for deportation, and it gives that person some opportunities, some benefits in the interim. And DACA granted work authorization and limited travel privileges. Something called advanced parole is a program that came from DACA. Advanced parole is an advanced permission from the government that someone for educational, humanitarian, family emergency reasons might have permission to leave the country and return if they're under this benefit. So that was all created under the 2012 program. What happened to DACA? Well, as you may have heard, back in September of last year, through the announcement of Secretary General Jeff Sessions, the Trump administration announced that they were rescinding or canceling DACA by doing the following. They said those with DACA, remember, they had to renew it every 2 years. So they said, we're going to stop accepting these renewal applications as of on or after March 6th. And they stopped processing the advanced parole privileges. So they said, we can't give you advanced permission anymore to travel outside of the country. We're going to let DACA naturally expire, meaning that they're going to stop accepting renewal, the 2-year renewal applications, as of March 6th. And that's what happened with the program. Well, what happened since then? Well, in January, earlier this year, there was a judge out of the Northern District of California that put a halt to the cancellation, basically ruling that the Trump administration's attempt to cancel DACA was done improperly under the Administrative Procedures Act. So what they said is he instituted a preliminary injunction and ruled that, you know what, U.S. immigration, you still need to continue accepting these renewal applications while we figure this out in court. Okay? So as of June 13, USCIS, which is Immigration, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, announced its process for accepting renewal applications once again. Before I go into that, the two things that the judge did specify was that immigration would have to accept the renewal applications, but he did not require that immigration accept brand new applications for someone who's never had DACA before. And he also said, no more advanced parole. That's not one of the things that's part of my order today. So still those travel privileges no longer exist. So when I do this presentation, I kind of approach it in speaking to DACA recipients or folks who are allies or community members who support DACA recipients as well. So I do this in the sense of like frequently asked questions because I've done a few of these presentations, and these are the questions that most often come up when related to the current state of DACA. So that's how I'm going to approach this presentation. Okay, can I submit a first-time application for DACA? No. Under the ruling, it said only people who've had DACA at some point in the past can submit a renewal application. Okay. Just to clarify, so there was the judge in California that made that ruling. A second judge in New York had a consistent ruling, said that the Trump administration did not properly cancel DACA, and so there's two current preliminary injunctions against the cancellation of DACA. There may be a third coming soon, but for right now, these are the two court decisions that are holding up the cancellation of DACA. And so that's how we're moving forward with DACA as it is right now. So as it stands now, only renewal applications will be accepted by immigration. The difference is that person at some point has had DACA in the past, of course, that they applied, they were granted. It could have been in 2012 and it expired in 2014. It could have been they've had it since 2015 and they've been renewing it. But if a person has ever had DACA at some point, they are now still eligible to renew DACA under the current status, the current state of DACA. However, if someone missed the opportunity to apply for DACA for the first time, unfortunately that person cannot now apply for the DACA program. I've had a few instances like that. I was telling Maria, my wife is a teacher at Milwaukee High School, and she has a few otherwise DACA eligible students who are really close to the age for which they can apply for DACA. And it's just sad, they missed the cutoff by a few days to apply for DACA for the first time. They're sophomores, they're 15 years old. They were otherwise eligible, but because that decision came right at September 5th, 2017, and they didn't get their initial application in time where they would usually be eligible for DACA, unfortunately they missed that opportunity. But the thing is that right now the number fluctuates between 700,000 and 800,000 DACA recipients. For those 800,000, up to 800,000, if eligible, they can still renew as DACA stands right now. I have DACA, can I apply for advanced parole? That's that special travel privilege. No, as it stands now, immigration will not accept applications for the emergency travel privilege. Can I submit an application to renew DACA? And like I mentioned, if you're previously granted DACA, then yes, you may submit an application. Of course, there's some exceptions. If someone, for some reason, has left the country, they no longer fit those requirements to be eligible for DACA. Another thing is if someone has a criminal record of some sort, a felony or a significant misdemeanor, or 3 or more misdemeanors, that person should check with an attorney first before making that decision. Of course, there's other considerations that USCIS will take into mind. One is a national security threat or a threat to public safety. Those are usually the discretionary factors that immigration decides whether to continue to allow someone to renew the DACA program every 2 years. Initial renewal applications. So the way, this is a little bit technical, but for someone who's ever had DACA before, basically the way it stands now is if their last DACA they've ever had expired before September 5th, 2016, so that's about 2-3 years ago, they have to submit an initial application, which is a different application process. But everyone else, if their DACA, the most recent DACA expired September 5th, 2016 until the current days, they can apply for a renewal application. Okay? It's just a difference in what kind of application it is. The initial application is a little bit more lengthy, it requires more documentation. The renewal application is a little bit more straightforward, just requires updating your information with immigration. Okay? So that's, again, first though, everyone must have had DACA at some point, but if their most recent DACA that they've ever had, if it expires before September 5th, 2016, they submit an initial application. If it was September 5th, 2016 or after, they just submit a renewal application. And this is what an employment card looks like. This is a sample one, but this is the proof that someone with DACA can work now in the United States. It's generally for 2 years. It has their name. They get an alien registration number, which is their identification number with immigration, their country of birth, their birthday, and the validity period for how long their current DACA status is valid. And again, it's for 2 years. Okay, and this is information I give for DACA recipients or allies. What can I do to prepare for a DACA application? This is important to know for you guys, just to know what it means to submit a DACA application. It costs $495 to submit the application, which is, you know, not cheap for a lot of folks. So it's important to know that just these folks who are coming forward to submit their information, they're taking a leap of faith that immigration is going to give them this benefit without risk. They're also paying for it. They're paying $495 for the application. Not to say if included in that is if they get attorney service fees on top of that. So it is a costly application. This is where it's important, if you do speak with someone, don't tell them to just apply. I always say it's better to check with an immigration attorney just to make sure that there's no concerns, red flags involved with submitting an application again. If a person's ever received a citation, violation, arrest, charge, or conviction, they should gather information about it. I say if you have a max citation, check in with an attorney. If you have a red light camera violation ticket, check with an immigration attorney. If you were pulled over and then got a warning, just check in with an immigration attorney real quick. Because while that's not a disqualifying factor, it's important to discuss it and disclose that first before presenting yourself to immigration in any kind of way. If you're ever deported, ordered deported, or had a deportation case administratively closed or deported from the United States, we strongly consider talking to an immigration attorney because that has a significant effect on whether an application, it makes sense to submit the application and whether the application will be accepted, rejected, or denied. And watch out for notario fraud. Has anyone heard of a notario fraud before? A few folks. A notario in Spanish is notary, and the idea of a notary in other countries is different than a notary that we have here. In some other countries, mostly Latin American countries, a notary has the opportunity to fill out forms and provide legal services in the fact that they can notarize forms that have legal consequence or implication. Here in the United States, it's really specific. Someone who practices law or signs off on papers or notarizes something to submit to immigration, for example, that person needs to be accredited. That person needs to have credential. That person needs to have bar certification. And so a notary public can notarize a document to say, yes, this is what that person says it is, but that notary public cannot fill out an immigration form on behalf of someone and send it to immigration. That's notarial fraud. That person is holding themselves out as doling out legal advice. And that's something really important for us in our profession because we've seen scammers who hold themselves out as someone qualified to be able to prepare immigration applications when in fact they are not. And what's the problem with that is that if that person who went to the notario got their immigration paperwork filed and then sent it to immigration and then immigration flags a problem with it, the consequences fall on that client, on that person. And that person can't turn around to the notario because the notario really isn't, there's no consequence for that person to like lose their bar status or anything. So there's little to zero accountability for the notario, and all the consequences fall on the client. And immigration, compared to other fields of law, there's no, oops, can I do it again, unfortunately. It's once you submit paperwork, it's like testifying in court. Every little detail that you put in an immigration form is like swearing to say something in court, and everything will be held against you. So it's important that the forms are properly completed, reviewed before presenting yourself. It's almost like a person going before a judge, and based on the information provided in the application, the judge is deciding, yes, whether that person can move forward with this benefit or not. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to be careful with notarial fraud here in the area. And we always get reports of it in Clackamas County as well as Multnomah County and other areas of Portland. Folks within the immigrant community, to be honest, who are trying to take advantage of a vulnerable population to begin with. And so that's what we always tell our clients, we tell community allies as well, please be careful in notarial fraud because there are people who hold themselves out to be attorneys who are not and will try to file paperwork and if done improperly can carry grave consequences for the individual. Okay, how and where do I apply for DACA? These are, again, more technical terms. These are the forms that one would fill out. It includes 2 passport photos, photocopy of the recent work authorization that's now been expired, the money, and this is the specific location for Oregon and Washington residents. But I'm not going to focus too much on this. That's just more kind of the process of how to submit a DACA application. All right, now this gets into more of a policy question for someone asking the question, should I just wait to apply for DACA renewal? So this gets at the timing aspect. So right now, as I mentioned to you guys, DACA is eligible, it gives validity for 2 years, okay? And currently, immigration is allowing renewal applications. And what they say is, if your DACA is about to expire within 5 to 6 months, that's the earliest that you should submit your new application, okay? However, we've taken the stance that it may be fortuitous. If you're about a year in and you still have a year left, consider applying a little early. And why is that? Because as it stands now, DACA is not legislation, it's not a law, and we're not sure how much longer it's going to be around for. And so, say for instance, I am a DACA recipient, and my current DACA is set to expire in February of next year, 2019. I'm within a year of expiration, but I'm not close enough so that it's 5 to 6 months out from my expiration. This is my opinion. I think it's worthwhile to consider applying a little earlier. Why? Because as I told you, DACA is being held up in the courts right now. And at any moment, that injunction might be taken away. And the DACA program would no longer exist. And because we're beyond the deadline of March 5th, if we hear from a court, a higher court that says, okay, we're lifting that injunction, USCIS immigration, you no longer should accept renewal applications. Well, then if tomorrow I wake up and I hear that news, I've lost my opportunity to renew my DACA this time. All right, and if that happens, I can work until February of 2019, but if I apply now, maybe I can add some time at the end of it. So if I apply today in March 2018 and I get approved by May, that might give me another 2 years that would allow me to work until May 2020. And so instead of my current DACA that's going to expire in February 2019, I might be able to extend that to get my permit extended until May 2020. That gives me another year and 3 months, which is super valuable for me in terms of my options and my family's options to continue to have work permission, okay? Some other attorneys might disagree with me, but I have submitted applications a little early since this decision has been made and it's been accepted and it's been processed with another 2 years. And it's really a guessing game at this point whether a new judge is going to overturn what this other judge said. And so there's no certainty of how long DACA is going to be around. What is certain is that DACA for renewal opportunities is available today. And so for me, I'm of a mindset to take advantage of an immigration opportunity while it lasts. And so I always tell folks, strongly consider taking action now. Yeah.
So the renewal is 2 years from when the application is accepted, not 2 years from when it expires?
Correct. Not when it was accepted, but when it's approved. So if I apply today, it may be approved in May, and then they'll add 2 years from the approval date. So even though in my example I said my DACA is set to expire in February of next year, they're not going to add 2 years to that expiration date. They're going to add 2 years from when they approve this current application, which is May 2018, which extends 2 years to May 2020, which you could say, well, what did that give you? Well, for me, I think it gave me a year and 3 months of certainty. For other folks, they say that's not worth it. It's $495. It's a lot, and every personal decision is that person's decision, of course. That's why I always say, check with an attorney, just know your options at least so that you can make a calculated decision for yourself, whether it's a good idea to apply now or wait. But I'm just putting this forward so that people know that's what's happening. And with the current state of DACA and all the uncertainty with it, that is why I lean toward taking action now. Any other questions for now? That was a good question. Okay. The second bullet point says the government has appealed Judge Alsop's decision. So they did it immediately. Once that preliminary injunction was put into place, the Department of Justice appealed, and they actually went through this where they tried to skip the Court of Appeals directly to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, as of last week, said, no, you have to first go to the Court of Appeals. But the decision is being appealed as we speak. So this was a district court decision, and the way the court system works out, we've got a district court, we've got a Court of Appeals, and then we have the Supreme Court. So right now, we're moving toward the Court of Appeals stage, and as it stands now, this judge's decision is allowing DACA to be renewed as it stands now. But it could be at any moment a Court of Appeals might disagree with the judge and say, whoa, 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 we're taking away that preliminary injunction. Immigration, stop taking renewal applications while we figure this out. And the timing of that is really unknown. And so that's why everything is in flux right now. The only thing we know right now is that immigration is accepting renewal applications as we speak. That might change later this afternoon, might change tomorrow, might change for another 6 months, for another few years. That's what's really tricky about immigration law and policy. So this is to fortify the point. We don't know how long this opportunity will stay in place. So this may be a short window when USCIS will be accepting DACA applications for renewal. So that's kind of our justification for that, my justification for this personal opinion. Well, what about Congress? So I started talking about our 3 branches of government, going back to our social studies class. As you know, the president cannot create laws. The legislature can create laws. Okay, so what's happening in Congress? Well, if you remember the current events back in September, the rationale of the Trump administration for canceling DACA said, this doesn't belong for the executive branch. This belongs in Congress. They're the ones to make law and policy related to immigration. So I'm putting this on Congress. Act now. And so he gave a March 5th deadline. Of course, today is March 21st. That time is gone. In the meantime, there's been this back and forth between the tweets that we read and what Congress is doing about what's happening with DACA and DACA-related or DREAMer legislation. We can also call it, okay? Again, unlike federal legislation, DACA by itself cannot provide a green card for someone to individuals and must be renewed every 2 years. Only DACA has the power to create DACA-related law which can provide for similar protections, same or similar protections for how DACA is operating right now, including the chance to give DACA recipients a pathway to get a green card or citizenship. Up until now, we have not heard or seen any kind of change. Here's a quick timeline. September 5th, they canceled the program and said Congress should enact DACA-related legislation in lieu of this executive order before March 5th, 2018. January 30th, there was a State of the Union address. And Trump called for citizenship pathway for up to 1.8 million dreamers. Everybody stood up and clapped and great, but it came with almost this raw deal that said, we'll give you a pathway, but in exchange, we need these 4 things, okay? We will A, give you the pathway to citizenship for dreamers for up to 1.8 million dreamers, but we want to eliminate the visa lottery. We want to eliminate chain migration, which is a misnomer and I think a pejorative term, but it's basically family-based immigration options. And of course, funding for the border wall, okay? So I'm gonna step out of my shoes of a lawyer and talk on my behalf as a human being. In terms of policy, what he's offering is saying, I'll let you keep DACA, but in exchange, I'm going to eliminate legal immigration to some extent. And so I'm going to take away a lot of options for family members to reunite here in the country. I'm going to take away this visa diversity lottery option, and I want to fortify this wall. And so in essence, what I'm trying to put myself in their shoes to try and think what's their leverage here. They're saying, we'll give you DACA, we'll give you dreamer legislation, but I want my wall, and I want to get rid of all these other folks coming to this country. And so if you could think about it from their perspective, that's kind of the back and forth that's happening right now. And that was addressed during the State of the Union, okay? And so that was the offer on the table. While this is happening, just an aside, there was all these deals being broken to avoid a government shutdown because what was happening is the Senate Democrats were trying to put in place some immigration policy reform as part of a deal to pass the budget. If you remember, the government did shut down over the weekend, and then by Monday, the Senate Democrats backed down and said, oh, okay, we were just kidding. We'll provide for more temporary funding in the meantime, which in terms of a policy stance, they lost a lot of leverage by doing that. They avoided another shutdown, and the other deadline is actually this Friday, I believe, where they need to pass a budget bill. Immigration law, again, is implicated as part of that in terms of the back and forth of whether the Democrats are willing to agree to pass the budget bill in order to avoid another government shutdown. So even before I came here this morning, I was checking the news just to make sure I was fully updated with everything going on. We haven't heard anything. There's a lot of back and forth about the Democrats and Republicans fighting over immigration policy in order to meet this Friday's deadline for passing the budget. If there is no deal, we'll go into another government shutdown and we'll see what's going to happen. But as you can see, as I said before, immigration policy is really muddy, and it's a lot of politicking, unfortunately. And in the meantime, all we know is DACA is available, and it's because of the judge's decision. It's being held up in the courts, but on the congressional side, in terms of legislature, nothing's really happening right now. And like I said, March 5th was the initial deadline. It came and went, and unfortunately, we have nothing so far. More recently, Trump says he's open to DACA legislation. That was last week. He said, all right, remember my State of the Union address? I said, I want these 4 things. You know what? Forget it. I just want border wall funding, and I'll give you dreamer legislation. That was as of last week. Up until now, we still don't know anything, but I don't know if you guys can make sense of our presidential tweets, of what's real, what's not real. That's kind of where we are at this point in terms of a timeline, okay? So the latest. This was a tweet from February 1st. March 5th is rapidly approaching. Democrats are doing nothing about DACA. They resist, blame, complain, obstruct, and do nothing. Start pushing Nancy Pelosi and the Dems to work out a DACA fix now. All right, Trump is reportedly open to an immigration deal without most of his previous demands. And that was what I was telling you about the State of the Union address. He's just saying, give me the border wall funding for DACA. Okay. And then after that, the Hill scrambled once again by White House's mixed messaging on immigration. There's a lot of uncertainty in what's happening, if actual legislation is going to happen as a result. I read a tweet yesterday that said, blaming Democrats again from the president. It's really uncertain what's happening, and your guess is as better as mine as to what will happen by the end of this week, okay? So before I move on to the next part about what happens if DACA does expire, do I have any questions about kind of current events or legislation? Or, of course, these are some of my personal opinions, and you guys can read into it as you want from your own readings of current events, but I'm curious to hear from some folks.
I have some questions just for clarification.
Sure.
So it sounds like our president had unrealistic expectations, like solve this problem now, go, and like didn't give anybody any time to like think this through. Like that's the understanding I'm getting from this. It's like way complicated.
I would agree with you.
Okay. And I'm a social worker, so if my boss was like, I want you to find people jobs now, I'd be like, oh, hold on a second, you know what I mean? So my second question is chain migration. To me, that just sounds like, sort of sounds like racist, and it just sounds like breaking up families. Is that kind of the general consensus for people who are dreamers?
Yeah, more immigrant advocacy groups have labeled chain migration as a pejorative term and said that it is meant to kind of stigmatize what immigration is intended to be in a negative light. The idea is supposed to reflect family reunification policies in which someone who's a U.S. citizen has the option, right, as it stands now, to petition for a spouse, a child under 21 and over 21, siblings, as well as parents. And so that's the way the law is set for right now. They're looking for limitations to that. Age restrictions to those relationships. I think I'm not sure which of the family relationships they're trying to take away, but it's included as saying, as expansive as we made those options in the past, we want to restrict that. Maybe just limited to spouse and children, whereas before there were more options. And so that's kind of what's being discussed right now. That was what's being proposed. But to answer your question, yes, it is. It does become really culturally insensitive to paint it in that light, because all of those folks who do currently have the option to come as siblings, they have to go through a rigorous vetting process just to be able to arrive here. And that's what's not being portrayed as of now. And so what's happening is people just hear chain migration as a bad thing. And so it's purposefully using that term in a bad way, in a negative way, so that there could be more, I think, of the American public to think that it's a bad thing and support ending chain migration. There was yeah, go ahead.
So one thing on that I thought was interesting that I read was originally chain migration or family unification was set up as arguably a racist policy to bring, because the immigrants at the time that it was set up were mostly white immigrants, and they were setting that up so that they would increase the amount of white immigration and decrease the amount of quote unquote other immigration. So it's interesting that now it's flipped a little bit. But my question has to do with the current state of ICE raids and stepped up deportation efforts. What are you communicating with folks who are scared to apply because now they're giving the government all their information, and if it gets canceled, what happens? What kinds of conversations are happening there, and how are you guiding them?
That's a great question. And the answer is we give a full scope of what it means to provide your information to the government. The risks involved, what you're sharing with the government, a DACA application, for example, is your residence, where you've lived for the last 2 to 5 years, your educational information, as well as answering yes or no questions to whether you're a public safety threat, if you've ever had any kind of criminal record in the past. Those are the most significant pieces of information that one would submit to the government. And you're availing yourself to the government. And we take that very seriously, and we approach USCIS and say, what are you doing with this information? Are you sharing this information with ICE? Department of Homeland Security is the greater agency related to immigration and border protection. Under that, we have 2 separate agencies. USCIS, which handles immigration and paperwork, applications, benefits. ICE, Immigration's Customs Enforcement, which is the police area of DHS. The USCIS policy is they do not proactively share the information of applicant information with Immigration Customs Enforcement or ICE unless it's necessary for a national security threat, public safety hazard, or if a deportation proceeding must be initiated against the person. Those guidelines are set from a 2011 guidelines from USCIS that said you can only share that information if that person is a top priority for deportation with ICE. Otherwise, USCIS policy is that we do not share information from a DACA applicant with immigration. And now it comes to whether you trust them or not. Generally, all the applications we submitted up to this point, we haven't seen grave concerns for a negative use of the information against the person, but we also need, it's our obligation to share that risk with a DACA applicant to know that the immigration policy in terms of USCIS is they don't share that information unless that. And that's all we can provide is the information we have and share our experiences and saying, well, for me, 100% of my applicants that I've helped complete DACA applications, not one has had a deportation issue up to this point. We do hear stories. There was a gentleman from Seattle last year who had DACA status, who was picked up by ICE, included as part of his father is being picked up, so he was included as part of that. And that was, I think, a political nightmare for immigration. But there's some stories here and there. But generally, I say there's confidence to be able to submit the application so long as I'm checking your criminal history and all other things related to you. I have the confidence that it's a good idea. Yeah, go ahead. You have a follow-up question?
It's policy by USICH. That means it's not legislated.
Correct.
It's something that they could make a decision on.
Yeah, and the thing with immigration, it's always discretionary, and you never get a full answer all the time. Is that sometimes they decide, oh, we need to get this person for this. Well, we just need to get this person. There's no reason. And we never get the reason. And that's just how the agency operates. Hi. No. A person can first be a citizen or a green card holder, and that person could petition more than one person at a time. And there's really specific salary requirements, income guidelines. If that person does not earn enough, they'll have to find somebody called a co-sponsor. It's kind of the more common term to help financially support that immigrant as they arrive here so they don't become a public charge. Basically so that intending immigrant does not have to get food stamps or other public services. And then that's what it means to sponsor someone.
Hi. So I understand DACA often is just related with the Latinx communities, but how is this impacting like other immigrant communities? I mean, of course, we've heard of other immigration policies or proposals from the president, like the ban, the Muslim ban, and different things like that. But how is this affecting kind of other immigration policy or other immigrant communities?
It's a really great question. And my first instinct when I saw this proposal during the State of the Union was, oh, the president's trying to get the immigrants to turn on each other. It's like, oh, there's all these DACA recipients who might have a pathway to citizenship. Well, this is a great deal for them, but it comes at the expense of a lot of non-DACA related potential immigrants who might lose out by having a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients. Here, I could speak to advocacy groups here in Portland, Clackamas County, Oregon, is that it hasn't divided us. It's kind of fortified our position that we are not accepting the president's proposal for an exchange for border wall funding and all the other pieces for a pathway to citizenship. The general consensus is that this is not a deal that we can agree to because it doesn't meet all of our demands that support immigration as a whole. So I think that's what you're hinting at, correct? And so I think that's a great point, and that was my instinct too, as like, oh, this might turn folks on another, but it hasn't been that way, at least at the local level. And I think in terms of national policy for immigrant advocate groups, it's been a similar position that we don't agree to this deal, and it sounds really appealing for a person in that position who has DACA, who might like feel enticed by a pathway to citizenship, but not at the cost of legal immigration as a whole.
Just to follow up too around that, I guess, how has like refugee and asylum seekers, like, because, children are also brought over as refugees and asylum seekers, and that's can be a very long and strenuous process to prove that as well. So, but DACA doesn't, again, my understanding is DACA is only for children from Central America and South America. Is that correct?
No. So DACA is available to anyone who can qualify under those requirements that I showed earlier, and the vast majority of folks are from Latin American countries originally, but we have DACA recipients from all over the world. In terms of refugee asylum programs, policies, that kind of operates independently of all this. There obviously has been new policy changes around a ban, a travel ban that restricts a person's ability from certain countries, mostly in the Middle East, to come here to the United States. But that's kind of independent of DACA. And so as a whole, it's not to say that because of DACA, another program is impacted. Other question? Yeah.
You were mentioning that for DACA recipients, it would be good when they do the renewal to actually present like documents regarding to their education or things like that. So why if they're not going to school and they might not be even working full time, just temporary or something, could that affect the renewal?
It's a good question. So the educational information is only necessary for the initial application. Okay. So someone who's applying for DACA for the first time, or if they had their DACA expired on or before September 5th, 2016, they'll have to worry about the educational information. Before September, when I filled out initial applications, for someone who was in school, did not complete high school, was on the pathway of getting their GED but didn't complete, so long as they show current participation or enrollment in an educational program of some kind, it could even be a vocational program, that would be considered eligible to meet that requirement. And so it's not necessarily a person had to complete the school, but if they showed an active participation in trying to get an educational degree or equivalent, they could still get DACA.
But if they're not, then it could be.
If they didn't graduate from high school or get their GED or they weren't enrolled, then for an initial application, they would not be able to meet that requirement and not be eligible for DACA.
But for renewal, it would be okay if they're working.
Yeah, renewal, there's no requirement to show educational information. So they can just keep working and it's not going to be a problem. Yeah.
I have a question about if somebody applies early, is there anything that could come up on their application for renewal that might not grant them a renewal? And could that in any way jeopardize the amount of time they have left on their current DACA?
It's a great question. there's always the caveat from immigration that they have the discretion whether to approve or deny an application. And so it's not easy to say the yes or no. But that option exists for immigration to say, we're going to deny this application, and we may not get a clear answer for why. In terms of something coming up, that's what we try to protect against and make sure that if we have the chance to meet with a client to go through specifically travel and criminal history to see if that might prejudice a new application. But generally, from my experience, what I've seen here at the local Portland office is that if someone is denied a new renewal application, that doesn't affect their current status. And so they've been able to maintain their current status. In my example, I said I had DACA until February 2019. If I apply and they deny it in May of this year, I could still work until February 2019. That's been my experience. Very few cases does immigration take away or revoke someone's DACA status. It's only really a handful of times, and it's at their discretion, and usually it's because of a criminal issue or public safety concern.
When you were talking about consulting with an attorney, can you give an approximate how much that will cost on top of the application for someone?
Yeah, there's been a lot of efforts, at least from American Immigration Lawyers Association for the Oregon chapter, to provide free services in conjunction with the Mexican consulate for Mexican nationals and non-Mexican nationals to provide free services. And that was usually, that came in a push for when first the announcement was made on September 5th, and again in January. We try to collaborate with other offices to provide free services. There's other scholarships available as well that help cover the $495 for the immigration application fee. Other agencies, it varies. Some charge something like $200, some charge a lot more than that. $200 is the lowest amount that I've heard.
Any other questions before we move on in the presentation?
It was good. Good questions. Thank you. So I'm going to move on now to what happens if the program ends, because we get a lot of questions about, well, it's being held up in the courts right now, right? And so, like I said, we could hear this afternoon, tomorrow, next month, next year, that DACA no longer is in existence. So what happens to someone who has had DACA and suddenly it's taken away, or the DACA expires and they're unable to renew? First and foremost, a DACA status is valid until the date of its expiration. And so if I, in my example, have DACA until February 2019, and I choose not to renew, or I'm not able to renew, I'm still allowed to work or have work permit authorization until the date of expiration, in this case, in this example, February 2019. Once DACA status expires without any kind of other adjustment or relief or renewal, the individual will return to the status he, she had before DACA. So it's as if I'm going backwards to what I had before DACA existed. In a lot of cases, for folks, that's undocumented or out of status. It's just kind of going backwards. Will immigration deport DACA recipients? And this is what I think I was answering a question earlier about what the USCIS policy is. I started this presentation just saying deferred action for childhood arrivals. Deferred action means that a person is not a top priority for deportation. And so a deferral means that immigration will recognize that a person is here, they have the status, permission to work, and we're not going to be a priority enforcement for deporting them. DACA will be removed. In theory, a person who keeps a clean record and has good moral conduct here in the United States, no other issues, no travel issues, no criminal issues, should not be a high priority for deportation. And that's the stance of Department of Homeland Security through USCIS, is that they will not share the information with ICE enforcement so that a person can continue. But I always say to every person I've come across who has no authorization or inspection without documents here in the country, there's always a risk of deportation under that status. It's just a blanket reality for a lot of folks in our communities. There's always a risk. I could tell you the difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration in terms of enforcement priorities. Under Obama administrations, whenever there was a targeted arrest related to a deportation pickup, ICE enforcement would have an individual by name and try to track that person individually. And if they entered a place where they found the person, they would arrest that person and take that person to immigration enforcement, usually to the detention center here in Portland and then to Tacoma. The difference now from the last administration to this administration is if there's a similar situation where ICE enforcement is focused on one person, they arrive and they find that person, and that person happens to be around other people who maybe similarly does not have documentation, even though those other people were not the target of the enforcement, ICE is more compelled to ask the information of everybody else who's around there and swoop up everyone else there. And so whereas before there was target priorities, now there's collateral target priorities. And so it's focusing on the individuals and the other individuals around that person in case that is the situation. And so that brings a lot of concern for folks, and that's why I think there's been a general increased fear in the community, is that any bad luck of interaction with ICE could lead for deportation. And that's the new reality that we're hearing, is that ICE is not necessarily just targeting folks for high priority of deportation, but anyone they come across as well. All right. There's a lot to that around know your rights and everything. I could jump into that later on, but let me finish up with DACA and the thoughts around DACA and what happens if DACA expires first. And maybe if we have more questions and people are interested, we could talk more generally about that too. Can a DACA recipient still use his or her social security number after DACA expires? A DACA recipient's social security number is valid for life. Okay, so there's one social security number associated with one person, and that's that person's number for the entirety of their lives. A person can continue to use the social security number for education, banking, housing, filing taxes. So remember, this is if DACA still is expired and the person reverts back to what they had before DACA, they still have a social security number, it's their number. However, the social security card contains a condition. These are all, does this? No, does it? Oh, it does. So a DACA recipient social security card has this qualification on it. It says valid for work only with DHS authorization. Okay, so that means the card by itself, if their DACA expires, unfortunately, this card by itself is not proof that a person has permission to work. But they cannot provide this social security card by itself as authorization to work. If you remember this card. So usually for a DACA recipient, with that social security card, they also have to present this work permit to show, and that's what that is, the valid for work only with DHS authorization. And so if DACA expires, even though a person does have a social security number, that card in and of itself is not sufficient to show permission to work. Any questions about that? Okay, what will happen to the Oregon driver's license or ID after DACA expires? Oregon DMV requires valid documentary proof of immigration authorization. So up until now, Oregon has permitted someone with DACA a limited driver's license card. So basically, whatever the work permit validity date was for 2 years, is that they would allow the driver's license to be valid for that same amount of time. Okay. However, and this is some good news, there's been new legislation. As of 2 weeks ago, Oregon legislature passed House Bill 4111A. The bill allows DACA and TPS recipients to renew their limited term driver's license using expired work permit. So that's very exciting for the community that we represent, because it shows that to get a driver's license, before you had to show valid work authorization or valid DACA, but now Oregon is moving in a direction that if you once had DACA or once had TPS, will still allow you to have a driver's license. So we're really excited for that, and the advocacy groups that pushed for that. I don't know the full details of like the ins and outs of like, well, what about this situation? But what's the main takeaway is someone who's had DACA previously, maybe doesn't have DACA anymore, that proof is still enough to be able to get driver's license. If you guys know the history of driver's licenses here in Oregon, driver's licenses were permitted for a little bit for folks who did not have status, and then the legislature changed that. And so now this is kind of a change in the right direction for folks who've had some kind of deferred status at some point to now still maintain their driver's license privileges. So we're really excited about this new legislation and hope that it goes in a trend of direction that supports driver's license for all folks in our community. Does a DACA recipient need to tell his or her employer that DACA expired? This is an employment law issue, is that no, the person is not obligated, in fact, under law to share immigration status. It's not necessary. An employer has an obligation to ensure that a person that they're about to employ has immigration status, and that's what that I-9 form is whenever you take a new job. And so as a DACA recipient, we always say it's not your obligation to run to your boss and say, my DACA's expired, now what? It's not required. That employee can continue to work so long as they meet the requirements of the employer to continue working. There is no obligation to do that. In fact, it's against the law for an employer to ask an employee, what's your immigration status? An employer can ask, oh, I saw in your I-9 you gave me documentation that expired on this date. We've reached that date. Can you give me more documentation so that we can update our I-9 records? That's okay, but a boss can't go and say, by the way, you look, you're not from here. What's your immigration? That's a very illegal question. Any questions about that? Ooh, sorry.
Hi. What do you do if they do? Like, how do you, like, they demand it, and then what's our recourse?
The recourse is you just allow yourself the time to try and get the documentation if there's another immigration option for relief. If not, yeah, choose to be honest or wait until they come back and say, remember when we talked about that, what do you have? And you say nothing, and then the boss will then say, they can terminate you based on not having extended proof of validity to work in the United States, unfortunately.
I thought the employer legally had to verify that everybody was legal, that it was.
They did. And they can do that through the I-9 process, that form that you filled out when someone starts a new job. And it's on the employer to make sure that that's updated. And so often employers forget or they just ignore it after that initial filing. And we've seen that in a lot of circumstances. But what is important on behalf of the rights of DACA recipients is that a boss cannot come to you and say, are you an immigrant, or where are you from, or what's your status? But a boss can say, based on our employment legal obligations, we have to ensure that you have continued permission to work with our company.
So the employer cannot legally ask you is only for DACA.
No, it's for anything. All
Because
immigrants.
because everybody else presumably had to fill out the form anyway. Okay.
Correct. Yeah. It's a little ticky-tacky, but it's an important distinction for a lot of folks in this situation. And the main takeaway as an advocate for DACA recipients who might lose their status is don't bring it up if you don't have to.
How does the employer responsibility apply to citizens who occasionally and casually employ people who might be immigrants, like for housekeeping, childcare,
Sure.
yard work?
In theory, I think there's requirements for the I-9 that anytime you employ someone, you have to fill out the I-9 form, show a document from one list or two other columns, and that's your obligation, just showing that I checked that the person is permitted to work and I'm employing them for this job. And that's to register, A, that the person has authorization, as well as B, to make sure the person has the payroll so that the tax implications are met. Anything beyond that, that's like employment law, tax law. It's not my forte, but I know in terms of immigration implications that that's the requirement, is that there needs to be verification that someone has authorization to work in the United States and they can successfully fill out the I-9 form. On the behalf of the employer, that's their obligation to make sure that the person that they're employing correctly fills out that form and shows that validity to work.
I actually have a question about that, Selby. What about like, I don't know, people in the neighborhood that just occasionally need someone to do, I don't know, like a yard work or
Yeah.
something? What is there something that says like if you pay this amount, then you have to submit an I-9
Yeah,
or?
I don't know that. Yeah, that's more like employment law stuff. I may have used to know that, but I don't know that because you can, hire the neighborhood kid to mow your lawn. Do you have to fill out an I-9? No. So I don't know where that cutoff is. Okay, here's a great question. My friend had DACA, married a U.S. citizen, then got her green card. Can I do the same thing? I always advance with caution on this kind of questioning. Every case is different, and there's no yes or no to this. There are some circumstances where this might be true. There's a lot of circumstances where this is not true. Whether you get your green card, which is a legal permanent resident status, which is work permission on itself, depends on many things. When you came to the United States, if you ever left the United States, if you've ever been removed, that's a word also interchanged with deported. If you have any criminal history, there's so many variables involved with that. Never file an application for a benefit just because you know someone in a similar situation did. And this is what I'm telling you from earlier about notario fraud, is that folks kind of prey on folks and say, well, I was able to do this for this person. You should be able to do it really easily too. Let me fill this out for you. You may waste your money, or worse, you might be placed in a risky position with immigration. There are some grave consequences for this line of thinking. That's why we always say consult with experienced immigration attorney or accredited representative. Also, this will allow you to make sure you are not eligible for some kind of other immigration benefit. Someone with DACA might find a way, maybe not through marrying someone to get a green card, but other opportunities. There's just a lot of immigration options that exist. That's why it's better to consult with an attorney if someone is curious or wants to learn more or wants to explore more options, just to really know what possibilities exist before affirmatively administrating anything to immigration. And there have been a couple of cases where people are citizens without realizing it. And so it's really interesting to know that, like, it's better to check and it's better to consult before, like, actively submitting an application. What does a person with DACA do now? Check with the individual DACA expires. If eligible to renew DACA, my advice is to do so as soon as possible. But first, I would say meet with an immigration attorney. If not sure about renewing DACA and or to make sure the person is not eligible for some kind of other immigration benefit, contact a congressperson, Greg Walden, to demand a new DACA bill. Of all our congress folks here in the state of Oregon, he is on record for being opposed to DREAM or DACA-related legislation. Our other congress folks are on board. And so if anyone, not in Clackamas County, but heading east, lives in Hood River, or you know folks in Hood River, Bend, as far south as Ashland, and anything east of that, you can be bothersome and tell him, get on board, because this is really important for a lot of folks in our local community. I'm going next week, actually, not next week, in 2 weeks, on a National Day of Action to confront him. And if at the very least, I'm hoping to make him uncomfortable. Most importantly, stay informed and stay out of trouble. New laws are passed every day. Stay connected to make sure you don't miss any opportunities or deadline. If a new opportunity does exist, you want to make sure you maintain a spotless record. DACA came as a result of really amazing advocacy in 2012 from immigrant rights groups. And so it didn't appear out of nowhere. It came from years of hard work to try and advocate on behalf of young people who arrived here. And if you can imagine the situation they're in, they didn't necessarily control their own fate. They were brought here by parents, or sent here by parents, or sent here by other family members, and they arrived here. They're essentially American by culture and by just their existence. They've gone through our schools, they're our neighbors, classmates. They're just as part of integrated into this community as anyone else. And so for us, when opportunities like DACA comes about, we want to make sure that folks are eligible for those benefits. So we always say at the end, make sure while we're not certain what's happening with DACA or other DACA-related legislation, keep a spotless record so that if an opportunity comes, there's no barriers to you being able to get that benefit. Okay. Okay, that's everything for now. What I do want to pass out, and then we could decide, maybe we could take some questions and if we choose to go in a different direction with the conversation. But this is a packet of information that I'm going to hand out to all of you. This is a list of organizations, legal nonprofit, immigration legal services here in the Portland and Clackamas County area. Thank you. Okay. It has ways for which one can have a consultation. Also includes the prices, I think, for a consultation, and the manner in which someone can contact the organization, including phone number, address, website. If you or someone you know in your community might be eligible for DACA, might have some kind of immigration relief available, or just wants some questions answered, I think it's a really good idea to check. There's a lot of options here. Again, my organization is the second on this left column. It says Sponsors Organized to Assist Refugees. That's what SOAR stands for, Immigration Legal Services. We have a number of clinics throughout the month that are walk-in, so there's no appointment necessary. It's first come, first serve. We just ask folks to show up and just sign in, and then we'll meet with an attorney. There's other organizations. If you choose to speak with somebody else, that's fine. We just hope that folks in our community can meet with attorneys if they choose to do so. Other than that, we have here Know Your Rights information that we pass along. And when I do presentations that are more based on Know Your Rights, it's important to know there are certain constitutional rights that someone has here if they're present in the country, whether they have status, no status, or mixed status if in their family. There are certain rights that are available to them, and it's important for them to know that. So the next few pages include that information on what to do if approached by ICE. Okay. Do I have any questions in the interim? Go ahead.
Yes, I was speaking with a woman the other day who said that her brother applied for her like 15, 16 years ago, and she's been waiting that long. Are there many cases that, and do you have any sense of how much longer these people are going to have to continue to wait?
There's some immigration petitions that have been waiting since '95. So yes, how much longer depends on the country, the kind of relationship, and it's a long time for some folks. But imagine if they end chain migration right now. Some folks who've been waiting from 1995, they might lose their opportunity, even if they've been waiting for 22 years, 23 years. Any other questions?
Is DAPA still on the table or relevant to all this?
That's a good question. For now, unfortunately, no. It was legislation that was put forward as late as 2015 into 2016, but there was a court order to stop it, its implementation by a judge in Texas. And ever since then, we had a change of president, and it's just kind of fallen off the table. DAPA stands for Deferred Action for Parents of Childhood Arrivals. It was expanded legislation to build off of DACA to protect parents of DACA-eligible beneficiaries. And there was a lot of momentum toward it, and it was really exciting. And then it just fell short, and it got back to the drawing table. And now that DACA has been canceled, it was like the change in presidency was really significant for immigration law. When it comes to DACA especially, it's that we had this amazing program that was on the precipice of being expanded, and then we changed presidents, and then that was no longer viable, and then DACA was taken away. And so you can imagine kind of the ebbs and flows of immigration advocacy and policy in this country.
I don't know if you have time for this, but sorry, excuse me. What kind of impact has this had on things like U visas and things like that? I don't know if you can go into.
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about a U visa. A U visa is law that's in effect to protect victims of crimes that occurred here in the United States. The legislation came as a result of recognizing that folks who may or may not have status are impacted by their status of whether they'll report crimes or they will help police with investigation related to crimes that occurred here in the United States. And the idea of the policy is that we don't want to stop people from coming to the police to help with crimes happening in the community. And so a U visa was available for those who are eligible, who either assisted or were victims themselves with an investigation of a crime that occurred here, to allow some kind of temporary relief that was opportunity for permanent status, to assist law enforcement with the investigation of crimes. Your question is really important because ever since the change in presidency, a lot of folks who, for the last few years, have emerged out of the shadows have retreated back into the shadows. And reporting by specifically the Latino community has significantly decreased. More concerning is reports of sexual assaults in the community, of the specific community and the broader community, is that I think reporting is down 90% here in the Portland area. And so you could imagine the impact of someone's vulnerable immigration status and how that impacts their daily life. So yes, it has had a huge effect related to U visa, but in general reporting here. I've also seen, I do presentations at libraries and I strike up conversations with librarians. I was at a library in Hillsborough and the librarian told me that Spanish literature circulation was down 90% since the change in presidency. People just going to the library and checking out books have gone down significantly. So sexual assaults, of course, is concerning. Reporting crimes, but it just all facets of life is impacted by immigration policy in this country.
Going off of that, how do you propose those of us who come in contact or work with people who have undocumented status, like how do we support them in this very uncertain time? We particularly work for a housing agency to help with homeless prevention and eviction prevention. And yeah, like there is a real fear around accessing social services. And yeah, just how do we communicate and support folks through this?
First and foremost, it's important that folks know their rights, when to speak to an ICE agent or not. Secondly, to have a plan in place. The last page here is a family planning packet. It has a site here for what to do in case of emergency. There's some resources available for folks. That's my number one thing, is just know your rights and know your resources.
My son's a kindergartner at Lot Whitcomb Elementary School, and we've come encounter with some of the kids. That's kind of sad, but we've invited them over, and just based on what our family looks like, the parents have had said no. And I'm trying to find ways where I can support and let them know that my house is a safe place, but also not start a conversation and ask them, are you documented or not? I want to know, I would love to swing by and drops off this at his school in the front office, but I don't know legally, can I do that as a parent?
Sure, you can legally provide information. I would say in that specific scenario, it all comes down to relationships and trust. If you can imagine putting yourself in a situation where you're in mixed family status, not you, but one who has made the tough decision to leave everything behind, come into this country without documentation, have resided here for over 20 years, established your life here, your children are born here, because they're born here, they're citizens, so you have mixed family status. You or the person in this situation, the parent does not have status. You know that at any moment there's a risk that if, with bad luck, you come across ICE, that might mean you are detained and possibly deported. In that situation, who do I trust? Who do I not trust? Who do I avail myself to? I'm not sure if, I could cross that bridge. I think it's difficult in that situation if you put yourself in that shoes, what choices you'd make to reach out, and I think it's wonderful that you've done that. Just know that it might take some time before that trust is built. I've seen that with advocacy groups here. People tend to naturally connect with folks who are in a similar situation or advocating on their behalf. But allies, I think, are just as important. And understanding that, that's been through our kind of personal experiences with community outreach, is that it's funny, when we do these presentations, we try to target like direct beneficiaries, right? Folks who really could benefit from Know Your Rights trainings. But then when we do Spanish language presentations at the library or the school, we show up and nobody's there. Why? It's because the parent doesn't know who I am. The parent doesn't know who we are. It takes some time to develop the relationship. I could say where we've had outstanding success is in the churches. I'll show up to a church and hundreds of folks are in there because there's that established trust. Part of it's because it's a sensitive location. I can talk more about that. But that's the idea, and that's how I would respond. But I appreciate you doing that, and I think if you continue to do so, I think that's fantastic. Sensitive locations. There are certain areas that are sensitive locations. This is a tangent. This is going on Know Your Rights, where ICE has agreed that they cannot approach someone to enforce immigration actions. One is a school, another is a church, another is a hospital. A place that is not considered a sensitive location is a courthouse. And so unfortunately, and this has been our more recent history here in the community, is that people are getting picked up, that's the word we use, at or outside of a courthouse. Someone who is just a witness to a trial can be in the hallways appearing and then get approached by an ICE officer. Someone who is mandated by law to appear for a court hearing, upon leaving, gets picked up by ICE. It's a catch-22 in that situation, right? But that's kind of been the terrible trend we've seen here locally, is that there's been a lot of ICE arrests and detentions around that location. But that's following this policy of sensitive locations. But I think it's important just to share that in the tangent because it's relevant to our community, I think. Any other questions?
Thank you. I work with teenagers and young adults, and they either have U.S. citizenship or DACA status, but I have a few families that are undocumented, but their children are still going to be minors, or they have a disability where they will always need, guardianship situation. So what happens if ICE comes and picks up the parent and, what happens, I guess?
The honest truth is the children are left behind, unfortunately. And so we've countered some really, really disheartening situations where the heads of household are immediately detained without notice to the children or the family members. And the most difficult stories to hear are when children return home from school and their parents are not there. And they later, first the uncertainty of what's happening, and later find out that their parents were picked up by ICE. And so when we speak with communities impacted by that possibility, we always talk about family planning. It's kind of referenced here too, if you have the packets on page 8. Be prepared, create a safety plan. And you could even see in that cartoon on the bottom left, it says, these are my mom's immigration-related documents. now that my wife is detained, we have to work together to help her out. And so we try our best to proactively inform folks that this might be a possibility and that here's the best steps for you to prepare yourselves and your children, and in case of emergency, prepare guardianship. And that's what this last page is. This is just the first page of a lengthy packet. I just included the information there. It's hard to read, but it's the Oregon Law Center Protect Your Family. It's available in English and Spanish on the website. It has this whole packet of information for how to establish a legal guardian in case of absentee parent that's related to immigration. And so we try to inform folks as best as we can that it is a improbable yet realistic chance that that might happen. And in that case, it's important to know what to happen to prepare your children, what to do in that unfortunate circumstance.
So I'm wondering if there's some sort of advantage to Washington state laws right now, because I work with similar families, and I've had 2 families who have already left. The parents have left their children here and moved to Washington, Vancouver, so that they can drive.
Yep. And that's the most significant one, is that Washington doesn't require some kind of immigration authorization or proof in order to secure a driver's license in Washington compared to Oregon. And you might see in my work a lot of folks who maintain a residential address in Washington live here in Oregon so that they could secure a driver's license. Before, Oregon did permit folks to get a driver's license without proof of immigration authorization, but there was something called the Real ID Act of 2008 that asked for a stronger vetting process by the states to make sure that issuing IDs meets the federal requirements. That's why you guys might always see, like online or social media, it said, if you're a member of this state, when you go to the airport by January of this year, you got to make sure you bring your passport instead of your state ID. And that usually includes Washington for that reason, is because they don't have a stronger vetting process to check for immigration authorization. So federally, they said, Washington, your license isn't good enough, and if you're traveling with us through TSA, you're going to have your passport. That hasn't gone into effect, but that's kind of how those two things are interrelated. And I would say, comparing Oregon to Washington, that's a really significant benefit. If you can just imagine in the situation of someone who's undocumented, having driving privileges is everything. Whereas even just like if you live here, Oregon City, driving up to Portland, if you're picked up on the 205, I-205, it's a really scary reality because you don't have local permission privileges to drive, and that carries its own consequences. That doesn't necessarily directly lead to deportation per se, but it's a scary reality to know that every day you're at risk of picking up a criminal issue. Okay, I'm going to wrap up just going through this packet. I'm not going to dive into Know Your Rights because I think the most valuable thing you guys can take away is just knowing you can take this packet and reference it later. Again, the first page is a list of the organizations. My organization is SOAR Immigration Legal Services. If you or someone you think might benefit from consulting with an immigration attorney, I would highly encourage you to meet with us or someone else in the area. The second page is more information of other organizations. The third page is Know Your Rights, what to do if immigration or the police come to your door. These are kind of our 4 fundamental talking points. When someone arrives at your door, stop and think twice before letting that person in. Remain silent. You're not compelled to speak to anyone. Stay calm and do not run. Running presumes a suspicion of criminal activity and allows ICE to arrest you if you run. So it's better not to run. And ask to speak to your attorney and think twice before signing anything. Those are kind of like our 4 tenets of rights for anyone here in this country. And this is just for added protection in case someone does come across an agent of ICE. Page 4 has an example of a warrant. We always tell folks there's a difference between a judicial warrant and an ICE warrant. ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. If an ICE officer arrives at an apartment door, a house door, or even a business door and says, I have a warrant to arrest this person, this is not compelling enough for that person to feel obligated to have to open the door. And why is that? because this does not come from a court, it does not come from a judge. This comes from ICE agency. It doesn't carry any weight. If a warrant has a judge's name on it, or it says court, then a person is obligated to open the door. We always distinguish that because a person should know the right of when they have to open the door versus when they do not have to open the door. Page 5, 6, 7, and 8 are some information pamphlets that say know your rights, what to do if ICE arrives at your door, or what to do if immigration stops you on the street or a public place. There's certain things that one should and should not do, and so we have some tips there for how to react in a situation like that. Page 9 is this local community organization, the Portland Immigrant Rights Coalition, that has a 24-hour hotline phone number available that gives a chance for someone who knows that a raid is happening to call this number, and then the folks on the other side of the line will inform other community advocates that a raid is taking place to reach out to as many folks as possible to inform them that that's happening. I'm going to talk about the importance of what a raid is versus what it is not. A raid is when ICE decides to come upon a location or a business and arrest as many folks as they can deem who do not have documentation all at once as possible. A raid is not when ICE comes to the door of an individual and arrests that person. People often confuse the two, and it sends a panic into the community. Because whenever people hear a raid, in Spanish it's redada, they immediately panic, and people don't go to work for the next week. Students don't go to school for the next week. People don't leave their houses, and it's a very sensitive thing. And I'm always cautious to call something a raid. But a raid hasn't happened in some time. There was a raid at I think the Del Monte plant a few years ago. There have been rumors of raids more recently in Canby, but that's also different because the other approach for ICE right now is to approach employers to verify I-9 information for the employees. That technically is not a raid. It does cause panic in the community, and I'm always very sensitive to that. But it doesn't mean that if someone has a concern, the folks on the other line are bilingual. It's important to just call this number. If someone in the community does have a concern that ICE is in their area, they should call and know that there's a resource available to them. Okay, and then the last page here is Protect Your Family. This is created by the Oregon Law Center, which is a nonprofit organization throughout the state. And they created this packet for that question of what to do in case of emergency, that a parent or two have not arrived at home that day and the children who are U.S. citizens or residents are in the house. It creates an action plan of what to do in that situation. It encourages folks to make sure that everyone in the household knows where the important documents are located, as well as provides information for how to complete a transfer of the delegation of powers in case a parent is not available, so that another guardian is in place to make decisions about school and health and finances for the child. Especially in the case that if the parents are deported, what are the wishes of the parents to have the children remain here in the United States with relatives or other friends, or if it's their wish to have the children reunite with them in their country of origin. So that's all the information here, and I hope that it gives you kind of a starting point to first look into this yourself, and also to share this with people who may be impacted in a culturally sensitive way, of course, but to know that the purpose for us when we, as an AILA member, that's American Immigration Lawyers Association of Oregon, we do these presentations so that we can empower other allies and advocates by sharing information that it's distributed in a way that reaches out to other folks. I know a lot of folks are in different services industries here, and you might come across someone who has status or no status. And just know that you have a little bit more knowledge now than you did at 9:59 a.m. this morning, and that you can share, at the very least, where to get more information if that conversation comes up, or if you feel like you're in a position to support someone. Please do not give legal advice to someone and say you should apply for DACA right now. Don't tell someone, oh, you married a US citizen, you should definitely get your green card right now. Please be careful about giving that kind of advice, but just maybe the best advice is to say, here's an attorney, here's some legal services organizations. You should check in with them. Perhaps that would be a good next step. Okay. All right. If there are no more questions, I'm going to pass it over back to Maria, and I just want to thank you for your attention and participation today. Thank you.